It is the morning of the 25th of March 1944, and you are in the driver's seat of a T-34 somewhere on the road above Khotyn on the north bank of the Dniester. The hatch is open because the fumes are worse than the cold. Ahead of you, the road is not a road anymore. It is a brown trench of liquid clay 2 feet deep, cut into ruts by the column that went through in the night, and the wide tracks under you are chewing through it at the pace of a walking man. Somewhere to your left, out of sight in the grey, a rifle company from the 40th Army is coming north through the same mud. When the two columns meet on this road, in the next few hours, a corridor closes and an entire German Panzer army is inside a ring. You will not know that for a day. You only know that the engine is holding, the clay is holding, and that nothing German has come down this road since dawn. That link-up on the 25th of March closed the ring around the German 1st Panzer Army at Kamenets-Podolsky, and it needs to be said plainly and early what did and did not happen next. Roughly 200,000 German troops were trapped. 12 days later, on the 6th of April, most of them were out. Something close to 180,000 men walked west out of that pocket and lived. This was not a second Stalingrad, and any account that sells it as one is selling something the records do not contain. What the Red Army destroyed at Kamenets-Podolsky was not the manpower of a premier German Panzer army. It was everything that army fought with. Its tanks, its assault guns, its artillery, its lorries, its horses, and the ground it stood on all stayed behind. 45 armoured vehicles came out of the pocket. Figure is the whole argument of this story, and it is worth holding to the end. The operation that produced the pocket was the Proskurov-Chernozhny offensive, launched on the 4th of March 1944 by two Soviet fronts in sequential attack. The First Ukrainian Front, under Marshal Georgy Zhukov, attacked from the north, opening the offensive on the 4th of March. The Second Ukrainian Front, under General Ivan Konev, attacked from the east and southeast, beginning its own adjacent offensive on the 5th of March. The stated object was not the destruction of one army. It was the destruction of German Army Group South as a going concern, and the liberation of the Ukrainian territory west of the Dnieper that the Germans had held since 1941. The pocket at Kamenets-Podolsky was a product of that larger design, not the reason for it, and understanding the difference explains most of what followed. The formation that ended up inside the ring was the German 1st Panzer Army, commanded by Hans Valentin Hube. On the 1st of March 1944, German returns put its actual strength at 211,545 men. That is not a rounded estimate. It is a figure from the German Army's own strength reporting, and it is one of the more precise numbers available for any formation on the Eastern Front in that spring. Under Hube were 18 divisions, 4 Panzer divisions, 1 SS division, and 10 infantry, light infantry and artillery formations. By the standards of 1944, this was one of the strongest single concentrations of German armour anywhere in the East. The weather that March did more to shape the battle than any order either side issued. The spring Rasputitsa, the thaw that turns the black earth of Ukraine into a semi-liquid for several weeks a year, arrived nearly 2 months early in 1944. It caught both armies before either had finished its winter positioning. Mud reached 2 feet in depth on the main routes and deeper in the low ground. Wheeled traffic stopped being possible. Foot movement became exhausting. Every river crossing became a bottleneck because the approaches to the bridges churned into bogs faster than engineers could corduroy them. The mud did not treat the two armies equally, and that asymmetry is a technical fact rather than a matter of national character. The T-34 carried wide tracks and a correspondingly low ground pressure, and it kept moving through terrain that stopped almost everything else on the field. German vehicles were built to a narrower track standard, and German motor transport was overwhelmingly wheeled. Lorries sank to the axles. Half-tracks bogged. The German supply bases feeding the 1st Panzer Army sat more than 190 miles behind the front, and once the intervening roads dissolved, that distance became effectively uncrossable by ground. Fuel and ammunition had to come by air or not at all. Soviet armoured spearheads, meanwhile, kept advancing on their own tracks through the same weather. The Soviet scheme of manoeuvre was a double envelopment driven by tank armies. From the First Ukrainian Front, the 1st Tank Army under General Mikhail Katukov and the 4th Tank Army under General Vasily Badanov drove south toward the Dniester, cutting behind the German positions and aiming to reach the river line and hold it. From the 2nd Ukrainian Front, the 40th Army of Konev's front drove north to meet them. The point of contact was the corridor running through Khotyn. When it was cut on the 25th of March, the last usable line of communication out of the German position was gone. Those tank armies were not operating alone. The 60th Army under General Ivan Chernyakovsky, the 1st Guards Army under General Andrei Greshko, and the 3rd Guards Tank Army under General Pavel Rybalko carried the northern and western shoulders of the offensive, while General Andrei Kravchenko's 6th Tank Army worked with Konev's front to the southeast. The breadth matters because it explains why the ring, once closed, was thin. The same fronts that closed it were simultaneously driving west toward the Carpathian foothills and south toward the Prut. No Soviet formation on that map was doing only one job. The advance had also been expensive in armour long before the ring closed. By the 14th of March, Rybalko's 3rd Guards Tank Army was down to 63 serviceable tanks. Poluboyarov's corps was reduced to 4. These were not units broken by defeat. They were units worn down by 300 miles of movement in the worst going in Europe, with recovery vehicles stuck behind them and workshops further back still. A Soviet tank army in late March 1944 was a formation with the striking power of a strong brigade and the frontage of an army. That arithmetic is the reason the encirclement, once achieved, could not be made airtight. The Dniester itself was the southern boundary of the whole problem. Soviet armour reached it and held the crossings, and the German 1st Panzer Army never crossed that river during the breakout. To the southeast of it, Kravchenko's 6th Tank Army and the rest of Konev's front kept driving toward the Prut and the Carpathian foothills rather than turning inward against the pocket. That decision is often read as a Soviet error, and it can equally be read as a choice of objective. The fronts had been ordered to take western Ukraine and reach the pre-war frontier, and they went on taking it while the encirclement was still being contested behind them. On the 25th of March, the ring closed at Khotyn. Some German and Soviet accounts date the completed encirclement to the 30th of March instead, and both dates are defensible for different things. The 25th is when the corridor was operationally cut, and the 1st Panzer Army lost ground communication with the rest of Army Group South. The 30th is when the Soviet perimeter around the pocket was fully consolidated as a continuous line. For the purpose of counting the days a German army spent inside a Soviet ring, the 25th is the date that matters. Inside that ring were somewhere between 200,000 and 220,000 men, with most accounts settling on 200,000. The spread is not sloppiness. It reflects which date the count is taken on, and whether rear area and support personnel attached to the army are included in the total. The starting figure of 211,545 from the 1st of March, reduced by the fighting of the intervening 3 weeks, lands comfortably inside that range. While the ring was closing, the argument that would decide the shape of the next fortnight was taking place at Hitler's headquarters. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein confronted him there on the 24th and 25th of March. Manstein commanded Army Group South and had spent months in a running doctrinal fight with Hitler over elastic defense. The practice of trading ground to preserve formations and counterattack from depth against Hitler's standing insistence that positions be held to the last man, regardless of the operational picture. Manstein's demand at Hitler's headquarters was specific. He wanted the standing order rescinded and Hubei authorized to break out. He set a deadline of 3 o'clock in the afternoon of the 24th and attached his resignation to it. Hitler's answer came at 4. The stand-fast order was reversed, and the breakout was authorized. It is worth being exact about what that was. A field marshal forcing the head of state to overturn his own doctrine under threat of resigning in the middle of a battle and winning. 6 days later he was removed from command. The pocket was the trigger for that removal, not the whole of its cause, but the forced reversal at Lviv is why the sacking belongs to this battle rather than to the general history of their quarrel. The direction Hube chose is the reason the pocket did not end with the army destroyed in place. Soviet planning assumed that the 1st Panzer Army, pinned against the Dniester with the river at its back, would try to break south across it toward Romania. That was the shortest route to friendly territory, and the obvious one. Zhukov's main combat power was positioned accordingly, weighted south and west against a river crossing. Hube instead went due west toward Buchach and Tarnopol, across roughly 120 miles of Soviet-held ground, away from the river entirely. The breakout began on the 27th of March, using a method the Germans called the wandering pocket. Rather than dissolving the encirclement into a race, the army kept its perimeter intact and moved the whole perimeter west as a formation, with a shielded interior carrying the wounded, the headquarters, and the remaining transport. 2 provisional corps groups advanced in parallel columns. The northern group was under General Kurt von der Chevalieri. The southern group was under General Hermann Breth of the 3rd Panzer Corps. A third grouping under General Hans Golnick of the 46th Panzer Corps operated alongside them. The armoured corps of the Western Thrust came from the surviving panzer divisions of the army, among them the 1st Panzer Division under Generalleutnant Werner Marx, working alongside the 24th Panzer Corps and the 2 corps headquarters already named. Those divisions were panzer formations by title rather than by holdings. The tank strengths they carried into the breakout were a fraction of establishment before a single Soviet round was fired at them, because 3 weeks of movement in the thaw had already stranded vehicles across half of western Ukraine with nothing available to recover them. The internal organization of that moving pocket was consistent throughout. An advance guard of tanks and combat engineers led west, forcing crossings and clearing blocking positions. A rear guard, built around infantry and the Tiger companies of the 509th Heavy Panzer Battalion, fought eastward against Soviet pressure on the tail of the column. The flanks were held by whatever remained mobile. It was a competent piece of staff work executed under conditions that would have dissolved most formations, and describing it accurately does not require admiring it. The relevant point is what it costs to run. It cost fuel, and there was none. Air supply into the pocket was supposed to deliver 350 to 400 tons a day, broken down as roughly 150 tons of ammunition and 200 tons of fuel. Actual deliveries ran between 40 and 100 tons a day. That is a shortfall of 70 to 75% against the minimum requirement sustained across the entire encirclement. Junkers 52 transports and converted bomber wings flew from Lvov, mostly at night and mostly unescorted, because the Soviet Air Force had roughly 500 aircraft in the sector against fewer than 100 German machines. When the improvised landing strips inside the pocket became unusable, supplies were airdropped instead, with the losses in scatter that implies. 7,270 wounded men were flown out before the strips failed. The fuel shortfall is the mechanism behind every equipment figure in this story. A tank without fuel is a pillbox, and a pillbox that cannot be towed gets destroyed by its own crew when the column moves on. The same applies to the assault guns, the towed artillery, whose prime movers had no fuel, and the 22,000 lorries and half-tracks that had already been sinking into the mud for 3 weeks. The German columns moving west across Ukraine in those 12 days were shedding their own combat power at every halt, deliberately, because the alternative was to leave it intact for the Red Army to recover. The route ran across 3 rivers in succession, the Zbruch first, then the Suret, then the Strypa. Every one of them had to be forced against Soviet troops holding the far bank, in flood conditions, with engineering equipment that was itself running out of fuel. The army covered about 93 miles of Soviet-held territory in 14 days of movement, an average of roughly 7.5 miles a day. Some days went faster. Others stopped entirely under Soviet counterattack. For a mechanized army in 1944, 7.5 miles a day is the pace of an infantry column in the Napoleonic Wars, and it is a fair measure of what the mud and the fuel state had done. Soviet pressure on the moving pocket was constant, but never concentrated enough to cut it in half, and the reason is the thinness already described. The blocking positions on the western face of the ring were held by formations that had been advancing hard for 3 weeks and were operating at a fraction of establishment strength. Soviet accounts have long argued about where the gap was and who owned it. The 4th Tank Army is the formation usually named. Any attribution needs a hedge attached. General Dmitry Lelushenko, the commander most often blamed, did not take command of the 4th Tank Army until the 29th of March, 4 days after the ring had already closed. Badenov held the army through the closure and the first days of the breakout and handed it over only after he was wounded and relieved. Assigning the gap to one commander requires deciding which of the two was in the chair when it opened, and the record does not settle it cleanly. Between the 1st and the 5th of April, Soviet command grasped that the German movement was westward and not southward. By then, the main combat forces were mispositioned against a river crossing that was never going to be attempted, and the distances involved in the mud made repositioning slower than the German advance it was meant to intersect. The Soviet blocking line on the western face was reinforced, but it was reinforced late. The relief came from the northwest. The 2nd SS Panzer Corps, built around the 10th SS Panzer Division Frundsberg and the 6th Panzer Division, attacked eastward from the area of Berezhany and made contact with the leading German columns at Buchach on the 6th of April. That contact ended the encirclement. Counted from the closure of the corridor at Khotyn on the 25th of March to the link-up at Buchach on the 6th of April, the 1st Panzer Army spent 12 days inside the ring, not 18. The 18-day figure circulates widely, and no record supports it. Now, the Audit, because the Audit is where this battle was actually decided, the German Army's own material loss report for the 1st Panzer Army, covering the whole encirclement period from the 11th of March to the 20th of April, lists 322 tanks lost. That count carries an important qualifier. It excludes Tigers, and it covers only certain vehicle types, which means the true armoured total is higher than the number the Germans themselves recorded. The Soviet claim for the same period is 357 tanks. The German figure is a loss report. The Soviet figure is a claim. Both are worth naming, and the gap between them is smaller than the gap between either of them and what the 1st Panzer Army had possessed a month earlier. The rest of the ledger runs the same way. 39 assault guns lost by German count, 42 by Soviet claim. 79 self-propelled artillery pieces listed in the German armoured breakdown. 280 artillery pieces destroyed or captured according to the Soviet claim, against German records that say only that almost all of the army's artillery was gone, which is not a contradiction so much as an admission. 21,959 motor vehicles, lorries, Mortier half-tracks and motorcycles down to the last dispatch rider's machine. 6,675 horses lost, a figure that quietly reveals how much of a 1944 German army still moved on animal transport. Against all of that stands the single number that carries the argument. 45 armoured vehicles, tanks and assault guns combined came out of the pocket. The formation had entered the encirclement with more than 400. An army of 18 divisions, 4 of them Panzer, emerged from 12 days of encirclement with the armoured strength of a weak battalion. Everything else had been destroyed by Soviet action, destroyed by its own crews for want of fuel, or abandoned in the clay between the Dniester and the Striper where the Red Army recovered it at leisure. The personnel figures point the other way and must be stated with the same honesty. German records for the encirclement and breakout give total casualties of 14,242, 2,311 dead, 3,567 missing, and 8,364 wounded. Against 200,000 men trapped, that is a loss rate of about 7%. Some accounts add a further 10,000 or more casualties during the breakout phase, which does not reconcile cleanly with the reported breakdown and probably reflects a different counting period. Even at the higher end, the manpower of the 1st Panzer Army survived Kamenets-Podolsky. The escape figure deserves the same treatment as the loss figures, because it is arrived at by subtraction rather than by counting heads at Buchach. 200,000 men trapped, less 14,242 casualties, gives roughly 186,000, which is where the commonly cited figure of about 180,000 comes from. Some accounts describe the survivors as about 2/3 of the encircled force, which is a considerably lower proportion and cannot be reconciled with the German casualty return. The honest position is that the great majority of the men got out, that the exact fraction depends on which German report is trusted, and that no version of the arithmetic turns this into a destroyed army. The Germans made their own claims about what the breakout cost the Red Army, and those claims need naming for the same reason the Soviet equipment claims do. German accounts credit the breakout phase with the destruction of somewhere between 357 and 399 Soviet tanks. That figure covers the fighting from the 27th of March onward only. It comes from the formation doing the claiming, and it sits oddly against the state of the Soviet tank armies at the time, which had already been ground down to a few dozen runners each by the advance itself. Claimed and confirmed are different words, and the German breakout claims are claimed. This is where the two halves of the story have to be held together rather than one used to cancel the other. 180,000 men walked west, and that was a real operational achievement by a German army in genuine difficulty. Those same 180,000 men arrived at Buchach without their tanks, without their assault guns, without their artillery, without their transport, and without the ground they had been holding since 1941. An army that arrives on foot with rifles is not a Panzer army. The 1st Panzer Army required a thorough refit before it could conduct offensive operations again, and by the time that refit was possible, the strategic situation it had been built to influence no longer existed. The Red Army had taken the thing that made the formation dangerous and left the formation itself alive to be dealt with later, further west, without its guns. The alternative approach was demonstrated at the same time, a short distance north. Tarnopol had been declared a fortified place, and its garrison of roughly 4,600 men was ordered to hold in position rather than move. 55 of them eventually got out. That is a loss of close to 99% of the garrison, against the 7% suffered by the army that was permitted to move. A separate German relief attempt aimed at the Tarnopol garrison went in on the 11th of April, 5 days after the successful link-up at Buchach, and it failed. The two outcomes sat on the same map in the same fortnight, and the comparison between them was not lost on anyone at German army group level. It was certainly not lost on Manstein, and it did not save him. On the 30th of March 1944, 5 days after forcing the reversal of the standfast order at Lvov, Manstein was relieved of command of Army Group South and placed in the officer reserve, which in his case meant retirement. Hitler awarded him the swords to the Knight's Cross on the same day, and the public explanation given for his departure was his health. Neither the decoration nor the stated reason had much to do with the actual cause. Hitler's own summary of it, delivered to Manstein directly, was that the time for grand-style operations in the East was past, and that all that counted from then on was to cling stubbornly to what was held. That sentence is a description of exactly the doctrine Manstein had defeated at Lvov 6 days earlier, restated as policy over the head of the man who had defeated it. Field Marshal Walther Model took over Army Group South in the opening days of April, with the formal handover conducted at the Berghof. Model's reputation was built on defensive holding, and his appointment was consistent with the doctrine Hitler had just announced. The command that had produced the westward breakout was gone within a week of producing it. Huber's own ending followed within the month. On the 20th of April 1944, at Hitler's 55th birthday gathering at Obersalzberg, Huber was promoted to Generaloberst and awarded the diamonds to the Knight's Cross, one of only 27 men to receive that decoration during the war. On the 21st of April, the day after, his aircraft came down near Einheim in Austria while he was returning from Obersalzberg. He was badly injured in the crash and died shortly afterwards. Some accounts suggest he was being moved to a new command. That is unconfirmed and should be treated as such. What is certain is that the commander of the breakout survived the pocket by a fortnight and the promotion by a day. The strategic result of the Proskurov-Chernovtsi offensive is the part that gets lost when the argument narrows to whether the pocket was a Stalingrad. Soviet forces liberated roughly 16,200 square miles of Ukrainian territory in the course of the operation. They reached the Prut, which had been the pre-war Soviet frontier, and they carried the front line to the foothills of the Carpathians. They tore a gap of about 90 miles between German Army Group South and Army Group A, splitting the German southern wing into two pieces that could no longer support each other. The Germans re-established a line in the area of Brody after the breakout, but they re-established it far to the west of where they had been standing on the 4th of March, and with the road into Romania and the Balkans standing open behind the Soviet advance. The Soviet cost for that result was substantial and should be stated at the correct scale. Irretrievable losses for the First Ukrainian Front across the whole offensive from the 4th of March to the 10th of April ran to roughly 45,000 men, counting dead, missing and captured, but not wounded. That figure covers 5 weeks of continuous offensive operations across the width of western Ukraine. It is not a casualty figure for the pocket, and using it as one distorts both battles. So the ledger closes like this. The Red Army set a trap in the worst movement conditions of the year, closed it with tank armies that were already worn to a fraction of their establishment, and held it shut for 12 days against a determined and competently handled breakout. It failed to destroy the 200,000 men inside, and the men who ran the Soviet operation knew that at the time. What it did instead was strip a first-rank German Panzer army of 322 tanks by German count, 39 assault guns, the better part of 300 artillery pieces, nearly 22,000 motor vehicles, and 6,500 horses, reduce its armoured strength to 45 vehicles, take 16,000 square miles of Ukraine off it, split the German southern front in two, and force the removal of the most capable operational commander the Germans had in the east. Kamenets-Podolsky was not a Stalingrad, and it did not need to be one. The 1st Panzer Army walked out of the ring in April 1944. It walked out on foot, and it never got its teeth